Good evening. I call this meeting to order. We have today one item in the agenda, and it's urban forestry tree topping update. I want to welcome Community Service Department.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Council Chair, Council members. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Thank you for your time and this chance to present an update to the forestry program's No Tree Topping Initiative. I'm Ian Gray, your Urban Forestry and Natural Resources Manager. I'd like to share with you what Community Services has in mind as an initiative to get information out to the public regarding the rules we have about tree topping. Next slide, please. So there were a series of unfortunate and noticeable tree topping incidents in the city in Renton late last winter, early spring, which is typically when this happens. It's otherwise known as shearing, pollarding, rounding over, hat racking, but by any name, it's pretty ugly when it first happens. This sort of tree trimming has been discredited for a few decades now for a variety of very good reasons, and we can go into some of that here in a minute. Without being too graphic, the human equivalent would be having your fingers cut off at the third knuckle. You might survive it, but the risk of infection is high. It depletes your resources, and you'll never be the same again, and always at the risk of health problems in the future. For trees, it's not much different. It increases maintenance costs, it damages their health, and often kills them, but it certainly creates future risk. Not only is it incredibly ugly, but it's very unnecessary. The problem has been cropping up on private and, more importantly, on public property at a few places across the city. And this is problematic for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it jeopardizes our Tree City USA status, and that designation is contingent on having a codified and enforced no tree topping initiative or no topping rule. We do indeed have those ordinances. We have no tree topping ordinances. And we also do not allow any trimming of city trees without written permission. And by and large, we never top city trees apart from really specific cases. And I can only think of one incident recently where we had to do that. Unfortunately, some city trees have been topped by private property owners. So basically, moving forward, we either enforce the rules evenly and equally, or we don't. It simply wouldn't be ethical to do otherwise. But this will require some outreach and re-education citywide over the course of this year and for years to come, to be honest. It's something that you need to keep reminding people.
And do we need to forward the slides at all?
Not yet. Coming up. Sorry, this is a longer session. When we get to the end of the winter next year, when this pruning typically happens, people will hopefully have a better idea of what the rules are. And code enforcement could be involved thereafter. Okay, next slide. So why is tree topping bad? For one, it's unattractive and ruins the natural shape of a tree. For the most part, you don't need to do this to trees. It's particularly bad for tree health. It makes them more prone to disease and decay. So if you think about it, when you're removing all the branches on a tree, you're eliminating the ability for the tree to produce food for itself, which is, it needs leaves and branches to do that. So it puts it into a resource deficit. So essentially you're forcing the tree to spend extra energy to heal and protect itself, and then extra energy to grow new branches and leaves to replace the lost leaf coverage. And one of the critical things is that the topping inevitably creates these decay pockets, which structurally weakens the tree, because what ends up happening is the tree sends out these very fast growing shoots to recover that lost food capacity, photosynthesis capacity. And so those sprouts end up being very loosely attached, and often at that topping cut, you'll get this decay pocket. And these photographs show that quite clearly. And so the next time you get a strong wind or something like that, you'll find that these sprouts can peel off quite easily. So you're creating a lot of long-term problems for yourself. Okay, next slide, please. So what exactly are we proposing to do? Well, an outreach campaign for starters, and this is a good opportunity to involve and engage with our community. We need to communicate the information, some of the information I've just explained to you in a way that people can digest and understand without getting too deep into the science. And at the same time, communicate the rules and the regulations that we already have on the books. Hopefully, by engaging with people, we'll begin to shift their understanding and ultimately affect behaviors. Next slide, please. So we are thinking about a multi-pronged approach. We'll be considering direct mailings, something that you might do in a water bill mailing, regular updates on our website, social media, possibly some displays, virtual meetings, in-person meetings, as and when that's feasible. Don't know when that's going to be just yet. But also cultivating direct relationships, whether it's contacting neighborhood groups or businesses directly, just trying to get that involvement, getting that direct transmission of information, because that's really the only way that you're going to really start to get the message across. Next slide. So, messaging. And we need to be fairly thoughtful about how we're going to get this across. So, I'll be reviewing any material that goes out with the Community Services Director, Community Services Administrator, and working closely with communication to make sure we're getting the right approach. Next slide, please. So that previous slide was an example of Department of Natural Resource brochure. When we're talking about mailers, I think we would be looking at a general mailer, which would include other tree trimming information, not just about tree topping, but we would reposition that at the top of the list. We do have handouts that we use, for example, for the rules pertaining to residential tree removal. And then we can look at more specific mailers, which would be potentially more targeted or sent directly to business or property owners where we know that tree topping has definitely happened in the past. A little bit more delicate, but again, we'll have to curate the material carefully to make sure we've got the right approach. Next slide, please. So this slide gives you a good example of some of the existing brochures and information that are out there. On the left-hand side, this is the Trees Are Good series from the ISA, the International Society of Arboriculture. They have a whole series of brochures, everything from tree planting to tree topping to how to hire an arborist. It's really good material. They're short, sort of trifold brochures, so we can certainly create good information packets. The page on the right is from the existing City of Renton Tree Owners Manual. They've got a whole page in there which discusses some of the pros and cons of why tree topping is a bad thing. So again, there's lots of material there. We just need to think of the best way to package that and get it out there so people can digest it easily and take it on board. Next slide, please. I particularly like a slide like this. This is a good way of showing, by looking at the silhouette of a tree, what you're potentially talking about when you are looking at different types of pruning. So you're starting on the left, that might be a tree before you do anything, and then there's different types of pruning, and we refer to it as crown cleaning, crown thinning, crown raising, crown reduction. The crown being the upper canopy, the main canopy of a tree. When we talk about crown cleaning, we're targeting dead, diseased, crossing branches, and that's pretty much it. You're just trying to open it up a little bit without taking too much live tissue out of the tree. Crown thinning, you might be doing the same thing, but you might be trying to reduce that overall tree mass a bit more drastically with a thinning, or it might have a lot of dead branches in it, so it might look a little bit more sparse by the time you get done with it. But you're basically, with all of these, you're leaving the general shape of the tree and leaving that top, the leader, more or less intact. You don't want to be chopping that off. You want to try and maintain that structure of the tree. Crown raising is something that you'll particularly see above sidewalks and streets, and that's a very specific purpose for safety, for clearance for vehicles, for pedestrians. Now, crown reduction is something you have to do carefully, but there is a prescribed way of doing this, and you can legitimately reduce the overall height of a tree, but you have to be careful about what you're reducing the tree down to. It has to be a viable side branch, and you're not just wholesale chopping the top of the tree off. So that's an example of some very specific tree trimming techniques.
Madam Chair? This is Randy.
Question? Hi, Randy.
Yeah. Is it okay if I ask a question?
Absolutely, jump in.
Yeah. So that crown reduction, to me, it seems like it would not be appropriate for something like a Douglas fir tree, though, right? I mean, I can't imagine cutting off any amount of the main trunk and having that be successful. Isn't that true?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. This is more applicable. This would be a silhouette for a deciduous tree.
Right.
Well picked up, yes. This is something that would not be appropriate for conifers. This would be more appropriate for deciduous trees. And in very limited situations would you be looking at crown reduction. Sometimes it's also called directional pruning, in quotes. They sometimes use it near power lines, but you don't often see it done well, shall we say. So it's something handled very carefully. Thinning, cleaning, raising, that's what you should normally limit yourself to, unless you need to accomplish something really specific.
Right. So if we were to, say, release this picture as, an example in a brochure or something, I'd want to put a big note on the crown reduction, not to do it on cedars and firs and conifers or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And it may be the case that you leave the crown reduction piece off entirely.
Right.
So,
Good.
yeah,
Okay,
good point. Good point. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the details kind of lost here because the print is so small, but there are very legitimate reasons to prune. Typically, we don't need to do a lot, but we do need to do it in certain circumstances when you're repairing damage from storms, when you're trying to get clearance, when you're trying to improve safety, whether it's getting clearance above sidewalks, streets, or near utility wires. But typically we try and restrict the amount of live tissue pruning that we do. That diseased crossing that I mentioned before, there's some very specialized techniques for fruit trees. You'll see this tree that's sort of on wires on the left-hand side. That's a technique called espalier pruning for certain fruit trees when they're up against walls. It's a very sort of aesthetic technique for fruit trees. But generally, trees kind of look after their own shape, and they're not standard. They go in all sorts of different directions. Sometimes they've got multiple leaders. Sometimes they've got a single leader. So yeah, there's specific reasons to prune, and topping trees is not one of them. Also, part of our pruning standard, we don't typically prune for views. We don't prune to reduce leaf litter. And that you'll occasionally find people trying to justify what they're doing with tree trimming for those reasons, to reduce leaf litter, to improve views. So that's not something we typically address with our pruning. Next slide, please. So it's worth keeping in mind that our objectives here with the way we maintain trees in the city are first and foremost to improve public safety. Topping trees is the antithesis of that, and that's probably one of the bigger messages to get across. That it's not conducive to public safety. It actually makes trees riskier, more prone to failure, and more prone to decay. appropriately pruned trees are healthier. It makes for a healthier urban forest, and that's our main goal here. A healthy urban forest is healthy for the residents in that community. We have city code. We're trying to abide by that, and in the process, adhere to best practice and preserve our Tree City USA status. All right, next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of, a timeline, what we're looking to do here is get our materials together, really embrace the public information piece and outreach with the community, so that by the time we get to late winter, spring 2021, we'll have at least done a first good solid 6 to 8 months of outreach and gotten the information out there. Code compliance could be involved with egregious examples of it, but I think the emphasis here is really the public information campaign for the time being. It might be the case that we could look at some city code revision for fines and related tree protection ordinances. I think there will be some tree protection ordinance work coming up on the docket, but nothing scheduled as of yet. All right, next slide, please. So, short and sweet, but to review, forestry has a number of puzzle pieces to work through to better manage this unfortunate pruning practice. And the challenge with tree topping is that it will likely be something we have to keep reminding people about, which is fine. That's what we're here to do. But it is the important thing to keep in mind is that it is an opportunity to engage with the public. It's something I haven't had a lot of time to address just yet, but moving into writing the next urban forest management plan and consulting with various city departments, I think it is a great opportunity to get better information about our urban forest out there for the wider community. So thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if I could.
Thank you. Any questions, council members? Council member McCarthy.
Yes, thank you. So Randy asked my first question, and so thank you for the answer for that, because I think that is definitely a fine line to walk. I was going to ask as far as how far do you go, or does the diameter matter? But I think obviously including some sort of specifics on that will help, because I could see that being very, very confusing for people trying to figure out what the amount of the crown topping is. So the question I'm going to ask instead is going to be more directed at when we witness the bad actors. You mentioned we would do mailings to them, which I think is great. Would they look more like official notices? I mean, I'm not saying trying to get too much into the design, or is there a point where we would, if there's not a significant capacity, face to face seems like that might be the solution if it's not a significant number of violators, where it would make sense to have a conversation with them, because I could see the mail just getting tossed out potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's always the concern with mailers, that they go unnoticed. I think we have actually been building a case file of addresses and locations that we are aware of. And so just having that initial conversation in the context of, are you aware of that? And, trying to educate them a little bit before we go any further than that. As far as, obviously code compliance has a very specific process they go through for, building a case and giving notification. I'm not proposing to go there anytime soon, but just establishing that, that relationship and having the initial conversation with people. And I think it needs to be couched in terms of helping people figure out solutions to their landscape challenges more than anything. We can recommend.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, just to clarify, I didn't mean go get him, let's prosecute him. I meant certainly let's have a conversation. Which I think is what you're getting at. I just want to make sure, I was clear.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Madam President?
Councilmember Carmen.
Yeah, thanks. So Ian, I really wanted to thank you for this great presentation and for just doing such a good job of jumping into this role. And
Thank you.
And speaking for the trees, and I've really appreciated your communications with the residents. And I've seen some of those. You've CC'd us on some of those, and it's interesting because you're having some of the conversations that I've been having just for decades. And it's really common. Somebody's wondering, hey, I'd like to top my tree so that I get a better view, and I go through the whole process of reminding them how valuable that tree really is, how the tree canopy and renton overall helps make our environment better, and also how it increases property values. And,
absolutely.
And I kind of then start to lay out, you wouldn't want to top it, but you could maybe get a little bit of view if you just took off selected branches or, whatever. But it's really solution focused because, we all understand how you persuade people. You have to have an answer that's acceptable to them. In some cases, I've worried if I just say don't top the tree, they're just going to remove the tree, which is another thing that people might do. And arguably that might actually be better because we know a topped fir tree is a dangerous tree. But
right.
In any case, my point was going to be through the years as I've sent people these messages and stuff, I've wished there was a ready brochure that with pictures and stuff made it really clear. This is why we have a tree canopy, why we treasure it, why it's part of our Northwest environment, why it keeps us healthy. Here's some issues people sometimes have with trees. Here's some really good ways of addressing those issues. Here's some things not to do. And we may have that now, but from time to time, I know I've looked for something like that, and I can find the tree canopy report, but that's too many pages. I can't get somebody to read that. But it's just a brochure that's sort of solution focused and reminds them that the communities, that the really desirable communities all have lots of trees in them, and then explains how people maintain these. So anything like that we can include as part of our messaging would be great.
Yeah, that's a great idea. A quick fact sheet of some description that really covers the meat of why healthy urban forests are important. Yeah, I can absolutely see that would help. And we can certainly curate some handouts that speak to that. That's a good idea.
I mean, words that I've seen you put into emails would be perfect. I know you could write it all, in an hour, I think. So anyways, that'd be worthwhile, I think.
Thank you. I have a question.
Yes.
About our conversation and communication with our different agencies and partners. I do appreciate, for example, that Puget Sound Energy tries to clear some of the utilities during the fall, at the end of the fall, but at the same time that I see cleaning those utility wires, I cannot call what they do pruning or topping. I just see what is called chopping. And they really, after that happened, you see how the trees start growing in a different ways, and the shape is terrible. Some of them die. And I don't know how we can improve the communication with some of these agencies to understand what is the goal of the city and help us. And I'm gonna at this moment make a pause and give the voice to Councilmember Benedetti that also has a question.
Thank you so much. Let me lower my hand here. The thing that I think might be difficult for folks to understand is the contrast between the situation that we had down on Third when we were where the trees needed to be removed, and there was a lot of really helping people to try and come to understand that the why behind it, and the contrast with something like, and on your own property we don't want you to. I think that because it's all very nuanced, we need to maybe be careful in our communication to be able to talk about both kinds of things. When it is that we would remove a tree, and that there'd be a tree that needed removing, and when it is that, and why it is that we want to be very, very careful with the ones that we have. Yeah. Because I think that folks will look at those two and see, and say, what's up?
Yeah, and you are right, it is very nuanced. Obviously, larger trees give us lots of extra value, so trying to keep them healthy and in the environment is a huge benefit. And then you have the further nuance of trying to tell people, or seeming like you're trying to tell people what to do on their own private property. Okay, city property, city trees is one thing, but what people do on their own property, that's always even more of a hot button issue. So
Right.
finding that balance of, looking after the city's end of things, but not being too much of a nanny state and telling them what to do. That's always a tough one. And yes, in terms of the utility situation, I used to work for Asplund way back in the day in another life as a line clearance arborist, chopping trees away from the power lines. It's not pretty. It's one of these infrastructure conflicts that we deal with on a constant basis, whether it's tree roots pushing up sidewalks or trees getting into power lines. We like having electricity, we like having sidewalks, we like having the trees, and finding a happy medium is always a challenge. PSE does typically reach out at the beginning of each season to review with us what circuits they're going to be working on. And we try and get ahead of the game and look at the trees that might be impacted. And where appropriate, we'll say, yeah, you just really need to remove that tree completely, because there's no way to prune that anymore without it becoming even more of an issue. They used to be more proactive about offering things like coupons to replant trees. And it's something we can certainly agitate for more strongly moving ahead. So that we get rid of the really ugly, dangerous trees and start getting some, new, healthy trees back into the environment. So, but yeah, it's supervision and keeping an eye on things. Absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And for me, it's two things. One is, of course, is first of all the safety more than anything else, but also it is very visual. And, and beautifying the area and environment and providing shade, and it's a lot of elements combined. And absolutely, I agree with you. If you ask me if I'm gonna rule for what, I always gonna share up the tree before I share anything else. But that's me because I love trees, But anyhow, does anybody has any more questions? Seeing none, I want to thank you again for this approach. I think is very proactive, especially for maintaining this city very, very green and healthy. More than anything, these weeks is a great reminder of why we have to appreciate our planet and our environment, and why we should never take for granted a blue sky, and apart to have a blue sky and great environment is to have healthy trees, right?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you, and this meeting is adjourned.